Good morning, good night, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. This is Tasemere, your host with the Blackout Live from New York, and I have a very special guest that you guys already see on the screen, Charlie O'Donnell. And I'm just going to give a brief little introduction about what today's segment is all about. So I know that we all have been hearing about VCs, angel investors. How can we tap into that market for our businesses? And I thought it would be best to just talk to someone that is a decision maker themselves to get these answers. And so Charlie O'Donnell is the sole partner and founder of Brooklyn Bridge Ventures that makes seed and pre-seed investments for the first was the first venture firm located in Brooklyn, New York. This is also where he was born. Brooklyn Bridge Ventures was in the first round of the Wing Hungry Root Clubhouse, amongst others. And he has so much information, rich information, that I'm sure he can share with us today. So thank you so much, Charlie, for being a part of today's segment.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So can we just jump right in? How did you even get into VC funding? What was that journey like for you?
Yeah, sure. So, just to set a little bit of a context, um, VCs generally invest other people's money, and angel investors usually invest their own money. So, VCs do put some of their own money into their funds, but for the most part, they are investment managers of other people's capital. I actually started out on the capital side. I was a finance major, grew up here in New York. Wall Street loomed large, and that was the sort of, at least where I was growing up, like smart, ambitious people tried to make it on Wall Street, and that's, where I had my visibility towards. Um, I wound up getting an internship and one that I kept throughout college at the General Motors pension fund. Now, all of that money that is getting paid out to people who've worked in factories and all of that sort of stuff gets managed in a pool, and that pool has become very large over time because obviously there are a lot of people who have worked for GM over the years, and that pool is run by a company that is owned by GM. It's internal to the company that invests in a lot of different types of asset classes, the stock market, real estate, and they also do a bit of venture capital. And so what we mostly did was invest in funds like mine. So if you ever meet a venture capitalist or a VC, it's very easy to forget that we have to pitch too. We go out to pitch to pension funds and high net worth individuals and endowments and foundations to get our money to go invest in startups, because somebody like GM is trying to put so much money to work. They don't have the bandwidth to look at every individual business plan and to be writing checks of $500,000 or $1 million. They're looking to put 20, 30, 40, 50 to work at one time in a manager who's then going to dole it out into kind of smaller chunks. So I worked there for a bit. I got pitched by a New York based venture capital firm called Union Square Ventures way back in 2004, which didn't seem like a long time ago, but now it does. And wound up joining them and went on to another firm called First Round Capital, helping them open up their New York office. And after working for two really, really great firms, I realized that I don't really love working on a team. I like working as an individual. I like making my own decisions. And so I broke out and started my own fund, which involved pitching a lot of people to try and get startup capital for my fund, and closed that first fund about 10 years ago with 50 initial investors. It was an $8 million fund. And since then have raised two more. VCs raise their funds in a series. They'll raise a bit of capital, put it to work for anywhere between 2 and 4 years, then raise another bit of capital to put it to work in another bunch of companies, and so on and so forth. So if you think about companies raise their money in rounds. VCs raise their money in funds. And so I'm on my third fund. I'm about midway through investing in New York area startup companies.
Thank you for that background and context, because I think that VC funding for most people is something that is really new for them, and a new sort of vocabulary. And I think, in my estimation, some startups and or small businesses are confusing VCs and angels with each other, but also confusing this funding source with traditional banking, right?
Sure.
And so I think that that was really helpful to just give an overview of what VC funding is, and also why some businesses might not be poised for VCs yet, because you guys have to also, make some metrics on why you're investing in certain companies and have some sort of estimation around how successful that company can be, because you also have to go out and pitch as well. So you need your portfolio to be really strong. So that leads me into a question around, what are you looking for when someone is presenting a company to you for VC backing? Like, what are some of the things that you have noticed have been successful, like initial pitches?
Sure. Sorry. You think in VC, the criteria would be just knowing how to swallow, basically, but apparently not. So the thing to keep in mind. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. I gotta get some. I gotta grab some water. Otherwise, this is gonna be a mess. Hold on one sec.
So for some folks that might just be tuning in, we definitely are talking to the sole partner of a VC fund located in New York City, around what does it take for entrepreneurs to be VC ready, and what does this whole ecosystem look like and mean?
Okay, so pro tip: anytime you hop on an interview, you gotta have a glass of water sitting next to you. That's just for the future. So what do people look for? So I think the way to think about investing is that somebody is signing up for, it's like buying a ticket to the future. It's not a reward for the past. So many people approach pitching an investor, telling them all about what they've done previously, what they've accomplished, like what level they've gotten up to. And the reality is, that's good, because it proves that you're capable of doing the kind of things that you say you're going to do. But it's the things you're going to do in the future part that's really the most important, right? So you could take two businesses, right? Let's just take two burger joints, right? And they both make really good burgers, and they both launched around the same time, and they both have lots of customers, and they have revenues, and they're making money and all of that sort of stuff, right? They look equal to each other, except that one of them has no plans to expand to other locations. The owner is content to run it profitably. He's able to pay for him or herself, family, employees, all that sort of stuff. Very popular, little, kind of local place, right? And the other place is the first location of Shake Shack, right? Those two companies have very different futures ahead of them, right? And should be seeking very different capital. But on paper, at one time, Shake Shack looked like any other burger joint that just had one location, right? Here's our location, it's just making some money, and that's it, right? So the real big difference is like, where are you going with this thing, right? So you're pitching a plan that says, well, we plan to open another one here, another one here, another one here, and this is what we think our revenues will be, as evidenced by the one we did before, right? So that's where you bring in the stuff you've accomplished. Hey, our plan is to go hire a bunch of really good people. Hey, look at the people we just hired here. That's an example of what we can do if we had more capital to grow. And I think like far too many people get caught in the past because they feel like venture capital is something you earn through accomplishment, and it really, like 80 to 90% of it is all about like, where do you plan to take this thing? So what I'm looking for is actually a really good plan, and it also has to be like a plan of a certain size. There's something that people refer to as VC math, and I'll give you sort of my quick, kind of VC math. So I raised roughly about $15 million in capital. My investors have the expectation of getting at least 2 times their money back, if not 3 or 4 or 5, right? So somebody sitting here might be thinking, oh, I could definitely get you double your money back. But see, that's actually not enough, because I'm backing PowerPoints and prototypes and companies that, despite the fact that the entrepreneur tries really hard and works really hard, they might fail. In fact, there's a very high failure rate. 50% of the companies that I invest in will go out of business, right? And it's not because of a bad decision, whatever. It's just because getting something off the ground from scratch, especially in like complex technology and all that sort of stuff, it's just really hard. And sometimes it doesn't work out, right? Or sometimes you open up something and a pandemic happens, and then you struggle during that period of time, right? And so for every company that doesn't make it, for the whole portfolio to equal 2x, right? Somebody else has to do 4x, because it's got to average 2, right? And even the ones that do return something, right? Some of them we just get our money back, right? So what it means is the potential that I have to see is way more than 2x or 4x or 5x. It's got to be 10, 15, 20. And what it means is, for a company to return the kind of money to really like make the whole fund a good fund, we got to be talking about a company that's doing $100 million in revenue one day. Not tomorrow, not the next day, but 7, 8, 9 years from now, and have a plan to do that over time. And it's not a promise to do that over time. It's a plan. It's a best guess. It's a very well researched guess. It's a very thoughtful guess. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, right? But that's what I have to see. Somebody's got to come to me and says, yes, I believe that this can one day be a $100 million revenue company. And oh, by the way, my fund in the venture capital world, $15 million might sound like a lot. It is a lot to me, is relatively small in the grand scheme of venture capital funds. So you've got funds out there that says, hey, I wouldn't invest in this company unless I could see it doing $200 million one day, or 300, or being an IPO candidate on the stock market, right? Do your research. When you look at companies that are IPOs, and how much revenue they're doing per quarter. They're doing $100 million of revenue a quarter, right? And so that is the size and the scale of the plan that people are looking for when they're thinking about venture.
What I heard a lot was vision, like being a visionary. And I think that that is an easy term to use, but most entrepreneurs are not visionary. They think that they are, but they are really replicating something that already exists without any imagination for what this can look like, and almost like playing it safe, right? And what I heard was that to be attractive, you have to think big, because you have to be able to have the proof of that you can complete this task, but that is not enough, right? Like, you also have to be willing to push the envelope, and how far are you willing to imagine what this can look like and what that spin is going to say. And I think that that's really helpful, because I think that, to me, that's also the difference between an entrepreneur and a founder. Like, I feel like entrepreneurs sometimes are just busy working, so they're like employees in their business. And founders are like, where's the next trend going to be? What can I predict? And how do I strategically position myself to be that place, that marketplace for X, or that reimagination of X, because I know that this is where the future is likely going to take us. So I'm happy that you said that, because I'm always like, some entrepreneurs have no vision at all until someone else comes up with the vision, and by that time they're just trying to replicate, but that probably has moved on. So what are some characteristics that you think is important with pairing this kind of VC entrepreneur founder kind of mix? Have you seen any characteristics that successful founders have?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to think about the difference between vision as something that is a style and vision that is something that is a practice. Okay. So for anybody who's, and I haven't started watching it yet, but for anybody who's tuned into We Crashed, or, the WeWork story, right? The thing that people always say about Adam Newman from WeWork was that he was a sort of visionary, right? And he would talk about his co-working space business in very grand terms. We're changing the world and all of that sort of stuff. Now, I don't necessarily think that's really what people are looking for. I mean, don't get me wrong. He was obviously successful in raising capital and attempting to grow a big business, but I think at the end of the day, more so than the ability to describe your company in big flowery language, or to tell me that you're changing the world, right? If you build the next great burger joint chain or Thai food place, or healthcare app or whatever. I mean, healthcare app, you could actually change the world, but some of these things are just really good businesses, right? They don't necessarily have to uh, be world changing in that sense, right? But the visionary is to be able to look into the future and imagine, and to say, what would this need? What would this look like? And it's to imagine things you don't have, right? Um, to be able to say, well, how would you get this to launch in 20 cities, or whatever? And you might be sitting there going, geez, I'm barely paying my rent now. How I can't even think about that, right? And it's the ability and willingness to think about that is just really key, to imagine something that is not there, and not just imagine it like poof, it just pops into your head, but as a process to really think through. It's almost like, so I was in finance and I interviewed for like investment banking jobs, and they would always ask you these ridiculous questions. And my question, and I'll never forget, in one of my investment banking internship interviews was, if we stacked pennies to the top of the Empire State Building and then took those pennies down and tried to restack them in this room, could they fit? And I was like, I don't like, who know, how do you, but like, what they were asking for is, how would you even begin to answer that question? Right? Because like no one knows the answer to that question off the top of your head. Right? No one's thinking about pennies and the Empire State Building and all this sort of stuff. Most people think about pennies like what happens if you drop a penny off the Empire State Building, right? Not stacking pennies to the top of it, right? And they want to see how you think about it. And that quality is what you need as an entrepreneur, to be able to break down a problem and to be able to say, okay, well, I may or may not know how tall the Empire State Building is. I have some vague notion that it's maybe 100 stories tall or 90 stories tall or 80 stories tall or something like that, right? And so a story is how tall? Well, I don't know. This room is 1 story. Okay, so I need 80 stacks of pennies. Oh, wait, 80 stacks of pennies? That's actually tiny. Actually, I could put 80 stacks of, because what is it? It's just 8 by 10 pennies. Like I could fit that in the corner. I could fit that on the little, table I have my laptop on sitting here. Now that I think about it, yes, of course, it's not even close. Like I could fit way more. I could fit 20 stacks of Empire State Building pennies in this room. So once you sort of realize that little insight, you're like, oh, the rest of the problem becomes much easier to kind of think about, right? So that is probably the most important thing, is taking this chaos of the unknown and really kind of breaking it down and into something that is knowable, plannable, all of that sort of stuff. The other thing, I think, the willingness to ask and to learn and to be curious. There's a really great article a few years ago. I think it was around the 2012 election between Obama and, or maybe it was 2008. Yes, the 2008 election, because we were dealing with the financial crisis and people are wondering what kind of president will be successful. Someone who's more the CEO type, or somebody who's like more academic and sort of a problem solver, and people saw Obama as like more of an academic or whatever. And this article was written about what presidents are successful. And what they basically said is, you can't prepare for that job. It's like nothing you've ever done before. And so no one is prepared to do it. However, the people who are most successful are the people who learn the fastest. How do you deal with Congress? How do you hire a cabinet? All of this sort of thing. If you learn fast on the job, you will be better at it. And I think entrepreneurship is also like that. You have to be, sitting there and going, okay, I need to hire a salesperson, but I'm a computer programmer. So how do I hire a salesperson? What makes a good salesperson? Oh, okay, well, let me go find someone who has hired salespeople and be like, how did you figure out that your best salespeople were going to be the best ones? And did you make mistakes in hiring? And what did you learn and read and all? Like, there's so much information out there. Anybody, if they spent an afternoon poking around the web and on 3 or 4 phone calls, could get to 2/3 of the way of where they need to be on the ability to hire a salesperson. But you got to be willing to ask those questions and learn and pick it up and say, hey, this is a thing that I don't know how to do, but somebody else has done this before. So this is a thing I can kind of figure out. And I think those 2 things are sort of the most important qualities, I would say.
I love this conversation because this is really, to me, I'm like interpreting it with conversations that I've had with other folks. And critical thinking is necessary.
Oh, sure.
And I feel that somehow we have drifted away from having hard critical thinking problem solving abilities, and it has morphed into more charisma personality kind of things, right? And so people, in my estimation,
That's just not controversial. That's in society.
they feel like because I present well, or because I look really nice, or because I can command a room, like all of these are like really great skills, right? Like I went to X school, I have X degree, I've done X, but that doesn't mean that you can think, right? That could potentially mean that you have the ability to regurgitate information in a way that sounds like it answers that question. But it's something different when you feel like you can get to the same answer by non-traditional ways. Like I'm going to sit here and think and be creative around how do I solve X problem that works for me, is a whole nother mind blow of a thing, because that almost means that you're willing to do the work to try to find the answer, and even if you don't get to the answer, you've gotten a lot of information that will inform or change another part of what it is that you want to do. And so those are conversations that I've had with folks around, like, we ventured away from being critical thinkers. We ventured away from finding solutions to challenges or navigating. We ventured away from networking in a manner that makes sense, right? Like some folks are just like, I'm gonna just add all these folks on LinkedIn, and I'm just gonna send all these emails, or I'm just going to show up to this event and just hand out my business card, and therefore I've networked, right? But missing that relationship building piece in there. And it's just like a whole soup that I think I'm learning from this interview that makes some folks a little bit more successful at pitching to VCs than other folks.
It's interesting. You mentioned the school thing. And I think what happens in certain settings is that two things. One is being in certain settings, top tier schools, top tier companies, all of that sort of stuff, um, gives you a view into how other people are doing it. And you get a sense of what is possible. And I think level setting is very hard, right? Because you don't know the lengths at which other people are going to try and get something off the ground. And there's levels, I think, where somebody would be willing to do something if they just knew that that was a thing that people did, right? And so, for example, you might not have the money to get a full e-commerce site built or something, right? I mean, now it's become much easier with things like Shopify and all of that sort of stuff. But years ago, it used to, take a fair amount of programming and all of that sort of stuff, right? And sometimes you'd say to founders, well, why don't you just set up a form where if people wanted to transact with you, they could input their credit card information? And somebody say, well, yeah, but I don't have the money to build a whole site. It's like, no, but you can build a form, and you can see whether or not they would be willing to give you their credit card information as a test. And people will be like, oh, you can do that? It's like, yeah, first of all, a whole bunch of people have done that before, of just, just test sites to see if somebody got to the end, and just to prove data and stuff like that. And so it's sort of this permissioning thing of like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing that people did. Oh yeah, I guess I could test to see if people would actually sort of do it or sign up on the spot, even though I don't actually have the thing yet, or whatever. And I think the other thing is certain resume things give people the confidence that somebody might want to talk to them. And I think, in terms of being curious or whatever, I mean, there's a whole inbox that I have full of people who are like cold emailing me and telling me how they're a Harvard or MIT grad, right? And they assume that because they came from MIT, I want to talk to them, right? And I don't want to talk to them if their idea is not good. I don't like it doesn't get me anywhere just to randomly talk to MIT people, right? First of all, I didn't go to MIT. And but it's they have more of a willingness to make that cold outreach because they believe that other people and look, other people probably do perceive them in a different way, right? So it's self reinforcing, but it's very easy for somebody who didn't go to college or didn't, do come from wherever to feel like who's going to want to talk to me, right? Because I didn't do X, Y, and Z and all of that sort of stuff. And that holds them back, right? When that, it cascades because what it means is their pitch is going to be worse. And their pitch is going to be worse because they didn't get to do the same kind of research as the person who made all the asks of other people, right? Who reached out to somebody and said, "Hey, uh, what did you think of this idea?" Or do you know of anyone who's done something similar or whatever, right? Because they felt like, well, I'm not in this industry, so I don't know why anybody would talk to me. And they Google around as best they can or whatever, but they're just not going to be as well informed as somebody who just is willing to ask anybody anything and be super curious and all of that sort of stuff.
I agree with that. I mean, I didn't go to top tier schools, but what I did do was always had a confidence that I could figure something out. I and even if I didn't get to the answer, the end result was like I had a defined answer. I had all of this insight that I could say, okay, so now I think I need someone that can do this because this is what I had a hard time with figuring out. So now I kind of like drilled down and had a more focus point of who I needed to help me get to the next piece of this puzzle, right? So I always was like, there's one thing that I know I can do, which I can think, right? I can piece together what I need to do and what I'm capable of doing and what I need of someone else to bring to the table to help me get to the next point. And that has nothing to do with what school you go to, right? Like school doesn't teach you that. It doesn't teach you that trait. That's something that you develop over time that I think, to your earlier point, proves that this is what makes a really great entrepreneur, right? Because you can think through questions. And when you're asking VCs like yourself to invest in my company, you guys might feel a little bit more comfortable because you know this person can think, right? This person isn't going to run from a hard problem. So to bring a little bit more focus, I want to know what has been some pain points that you have seen with Black folks coming to pitch to you? Because I work with Black entrepreneurs all the time, and I have my own like Rolodex running list of things that I think are challenges. But what are some things that you think is still reoccurring when people are coming to you that make it a little bit shaky for you to invest? You're on mute, Charlie.
Sorry, I mean, some street noise. I didn't want to interrupt you with it, but um, so just provide a context. I have backed one, two, three, four, five, six. I'm losing count. 6 Black founders, and I think the thing that I notice about and what's fascinating to me is people, I think in general, who are anybody else besides straight white guy, look for signals of acceptance, right? Before I go and pitch somebody, I want to understand whether I'm going to get taken seriously. So let me go see who they backed before. Let me go see what statements they've made. Let me go check out Twitter or whatever, because I don't want to go through somewhere where I'm not going to be taken seriously. As a straight white guy, that doesn't even cross my mind, right? It is an implicit assumption that, somebody's going to take me seriously. And if they don't, that's their problem. It's not mine. And so what winds up happening is if you wind up backing Black founders, it inevitably changed what your deal flow looks like, because more Black founders will come and pitch you. And it changes your network. And because the other thing is everybody's network looks like themselves, right? I know more bald white guys than beards than you do. And so, it changes your network. And I think that the biggest difference that I notice is that I think the assumption going into a pitch, whether you're a Black founder or really, any underrepresented founder in venture, is that it's so hard to get funding. And they look at the numbers, right? The results, what percentage of funding goes to Black founders. And they just assume that it's so hard that it's better to ask for less. And, because it's hard enough to get $1 million, so I should only ask for 500K. And that is the biggest mistake you can make. Because two things. One is, I have a big issue with looking at results numbers and assuming that that's going to be your result, right? Because first of all, everyone's looking at those results numbers. And if everyone thinks that that's going to be their result, then fewer people will pitch. And if fewer people are pitching, that's going to reinforce the result, right? So I was thinking about it like, if somebody, attempts to drive to a crowded place, right? And people say, you're never going to get a spot there. It's going to be so crowded. Well, yeah, but if that's what everybody thinks, then maybe people won't be bringing their cars there, and there might be a spot, right? You never know, right? And so, and there are lots of instances where I've showed up at stuff where I thought was going to be super busy, and it turns out to be surprisingly empty because everyone was thinking the same thing. The problem is when you pitch for less, two things happen. It signals for lack of ambition, smaller plan, right? Because you can just do less with less. There's some people who don't wind up doing anything with more, but it is, you're just going to be able to hire less people. You're going to be able to hire less salespeople, less, you're going to have less product progress, less sales progress, right? And so what you're able to pitch is just smaller, right? And so what I try to do, to remember to do, is to turn it back to the entrepreneur and say, listen, you're coming in, you're only asking for 500K, which, by the way, is still a lot of money. Would you not know what to do with $1 million or $1.5 million or 2 million? And all of a sudden, that confidence game changes, right? And whether it's a Black founder or anybody else, you say, oh, I totally know what I would do with $1 million. I was like, well, why aren't you pitching for $1 million then? They say, well, the stats, only less than 1% of money goes to Black founders and all of that sort of stuff. I said, yeah, well, based on your ask, maybe part of the issue is because they're asking for less, right? Some white guy comes in here and he's got a PowerPoint, there's no product, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to need $5 million to build this out, right? And he doesn't even blink to ask for that, right? And so, and that, by the way, is the majority of who's pitching, who's making that ask, right? So we get into this mode of VCs and say, of immediately taking things down. Whoa, slow your roll. $5 million. What would you do with 3? What would you do with 2? Right? So when a Black founder comes in and is asking for 500K, our initial assumption is that, whoa, slow your roll thing, because that's what we do to all founders, right? All founders are asking for crazy numbers and crazy things and all of that sort of stuff. So if we're in this kind of takedown mode, right, it's like a shift of behavior to be like, wait, what would you do with more? We don't normally ask that question, and we're not used to it. And by the way, VCs need to get used to it, right? Because lots of different people have lots of different approaches to pitching. And I think that's something that's on us as VCs that we need to change, that we need to be able to say, when such and such founder comes in asking for $10 million on a prototype with nothing, we should be willing to take that down. But when some founder has a genuinely good idea and is just trying to ask for 250K, that we should be building them up and saying, I don't know, looks like this thing's already working. You know, what would you do with a $2 million round? Because, by the way, you have more than the last person who came in here. The last person who came in here was asking for $4 million, right? So we should be able to do both things, I think, at the same time.
So how does someone prepare for VC pitching? Do they just go online and look people up and send them a deck? Or like, how would you even know where to start if you wanted to look for VCs to back your idea?
So VCs have made themselves much, much more available than they ever have before. And that is partially because of the change of where startups come from. If you think back to like when venture capital started in like the late 60s, early 70s, the only places where technology was being built was like Stanford, MIT, like just very limited number of places. Why? Because technology was built in a room full of computers that cost millions of dollars to buy and you know, to even get exposure, right? There's this interesting story of, you know, how maybe Bill Gates and Steve Jobs weren't as special as everybody thought they were. It just happened to be that they were born in a year that meant that as like early college students, they were some of the first people to get access to computers, right? If you were born 2 years before them, you would have been, you know, too early, and 2 years after them, you would have been falling behind. So there's a certain aspect to exposure that happens. Now, things have become much more accessible, right? You can go to a library and access the computers there for free and look stuff up and you know, take an online coding course. And there's lots of stuff available for free. You still need the time, and time is expensive, but it is much more available than it used to be. So now all of a sudden, instead of being a venture capitalist who just hangs out at Stanford, you kind of need to be everywhere, right? Because for all I know, there's somebody in the building across the street from me who is building a thing, and I don't know. Like, I don't, you know who they are or whatever. So I am much more about trying to generate inbound. I want people to reach out to me for their ideas because there's no specific place to go look, right? So that's why my email address is on my site. That's why I have a calendar request tool. That's why VCs like me are always showing up on podcasts and streams and all that sort of stuff. We're trying to put ourselves out there. We're trying to make ourselves available, right? Obviously, we have to do some screening to figure out, you know, where we think we can be most helpful. But we're definitely not trying to be hidden, right? So it isn't that hard to find the VCs. Now, you do have to do a little research to figure out like who's most appropriate for what you're doing, right? There's some VCs who like only do tech, right? And if your thing is retail or consumer products or beauty or what have you, then somebody who only does tech is just not, they're not going to know anything about what you're doing, right? So they're not going to be an appropriate investor. So the research takes a little time to sort of build your list. Stage is really important too, right? There's some VCs who are growth investors, and they only invest in companies who are making $20 million a year. They don't invest in prototypes. That's just not the stage they are good at, right? So again, it takes a little more research to figure that out. And I think the way to search it is just at least start Googling around, early stage VCs in my city, startup companies. I think the other thing is important to go back to this research point. I don't think entrepreneurship happens in a bubble, on an island, right? You have to be connected to a community in your industry or whatever, because how would you know if your idea is good, right? Unless, no matter what you do, if you don't have a sense of who is currently the best of doing anything like what you do, right? Of who the leader in that space currently is that you're trying to knock off, right? Of what the attempts have been to do that, then you're not as informed as you need to be, right? So you need to sort of be in this community of other folks. Like if you're building an app to uh, schedule delivery workers better, then you should know the person at Postmates who would be the buyer of your software, right? Because you should have already talked to that person and be like, hey, what if I built software that helped you with this problem? And they could go and be like, oh my God, that would be really, really helpful. Or, no, actually, I have software that does that already. And these guys over here, I use this. It's not perfect, but it works good enough. I probably wouldn't switch it. I got more than enough things to do. It's about immersing yourself in that community and always being willing to ask that next person who can provide you information, and being able to tell a person, listen, you seem excited about this idea. At some point, I'm going to look for funding. If you know of other startups who've raised funding, I'm looking to build up my list of who funds stuff like this. If you have ideas, please let me know. Who should I have on my list for the kind of person to talk to about funding an idea like this? If you have 100 conversations about your startup, you're going to turn up 10 names. There's no way you're not going to. And I think for the most part, folks who say, well, I can't find investors or whatever, it's because they're not talking to enough people. They're not, shaking loose the trees to see what falls out, because VCs really do try and be as connected as possible.
You dropped so many nuggets here, Charlie.
I think part of it is, no matter what you ask me, I've been blogging / newsletter writing, and blogging kind of morphed. It used to be just a blog. Now it's a newsletter, whatever. I've been writing for 18 years. And so I actually think something I very strongly recommend to entrepreneurs, even if you're not a great writer. First of all, the only way to become a better writer is to write more. But writing has always helped me put my thoughts in order. And so it used to be a kind of thing where alumni from my school or students from my school would reach out and they'd ask me questions. And they'd always ask the same question: how do I get an internship? All that sort of stuff. And I started recording the answers that I would give them in a document. And, then somebody comes along and asks the question slightly differently. And then I realized that the answer that I had doesn't totally answer the question. So then I need to update the answer a little bit. And the process of writing forces you to make sense of what's sloshing around in your brain. And so really all I'm doing, you're asking these questions, I'm like, yeah, I wrote about that a while. What did I say about that, a year and a half ago? Let me pull that blog post up in my head. I know how that paragraph should sound because I've rewritten it 4 times over. And, sounds really polished now, but it took me all night to write that paragraph at the time.
This was an amazing, amazing interview. I learned so much about VCs. Last week, I actually talked to someone in mergers, acquisition, and franchising.
Oh, cool.
Which was an attorney that focused on that, which was whoa, this ecosystem is so large. And so what I usually tell folks is when you say business development or business, you got to break that down because there's so many different like entry points that require certain types of understanding, and things change over time. So there's no one person that's just expert in business.
Right.
Because like business can come in so many different terms. You just explained angel investors versus VCs. You know, that's a whole chapter in itself. That's totally different than if you're looking to go to a bank, you're looking to do like straight crowdfunding. You know, just funding itself is like a whole series of books. So I feel like my knowledge has like increased 10 times about venture capitalists and what people should be doing to be prepared. Do you have any advice, like a couple words of advice for entrepreneurs who might be just fast forwarding on this interview later on that you want to leave them with?
Yeah, I would say don't get intimidated. Don't worry about screwing up, and also be discerning, not cynical, but there are a lot of people in this ecosystem who act like they know what they're talking about, that don't necessarily know what they're talking about. Be a little skeptical, and especially when it feels like everyone's crushing it, everyone is, you know, so successful, raising all this money. There are very few people on Twitter tweeting about how they just got turned down by their 10th VC in a row. Everybody tweets when they raise the money. Nobody tweets when somebody passes on them. And there's a lot more people getting passed on than there are people actually able to raise. And so, you know, keep in mind that it is not always easy. And then the other thing I'd say is be willing to shift and change. There's a little bit of mentality of like the best entrepreneurs just make it happen, and you know, never accept a no or whatever. But I do think there's a line where sometimes you got to be like, I don't think this idea is the idea, or this idea needs improvement or isn't workable. And sometimes being able to say, you know what, there will be something better that comes along, easier, that can make more money, whatever, that's a better use of my time. And you know, sometimes making that decision to stop doing something, I think is you know, important. There's no shame in saying, you know what, there's better uses of my time than this idea. I'm going to go find the next big idea, and this one isn't it, and I got 10 more, and I'm going to go find it. I think that's fine.
Well, thank you so much, Charlie, for dropping by the Blackout Live from New York. You're always welcome to come back
No
whenever you
problem.
like. But thank you so much for dropping by. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.